These numbers are absolutely crazy, like mind-blowingly so. 182 grams of carbohydrates every single hour. That's the number that's been doing the rounds since Casper Stornes won the Ironman World Championships in Nice this year. His sponsor claimed that during the race he consumed 182 grams of carbs as well as just under a litre of fluid per hour over almost 8 hours of racing. Those are some of the highest numbers I've ever seen reported for an Ironman, and they immediately caught my attention. Because on the one hand, the performance he put together was absolutely huge. A sub-8 hour Ironman on a tough course against the best in the world. But on the other hand, these fueling numbers raise a lot of questions in my mind. If you take them at face value, they are nuts. Ridiculous. But I'm skeptical as to whether he actually consumed that much, and whether it was necessary. I also worry about the implications of this for other triathletes and how it might totally mess up people's races, and we're going to dig into that in this video. Along with that, I'm going to talk about what's realistic, not just for Casper Stornes as a pro triathlete, but for you as an age grouper trying to finish strong without blowing up your stomach halfway through the run. Let's start with the carbohydrate side. If we take the sponsor's claim at face value, 182 grams of carbohydrates per hour across the race time of 7 hours and 51 minutes works out to around 1,450 grams of carbohydrates in total. Now that is an insane amount. And according to the sponsor's Instagram graphic, about 350 grams of that came from gels, because he consumed 14 gels with 25 grams of carbohydrates in each gel. And so based on the graphic, the remaining 1,100 grams of carbs came from bottles of carbohydrate drink mix. And I did notice that the sponsors suggested this was the case in the comment section, although the maths doesn't quite work out right here as we'll go through. They show 9 bottles in the graphic, which means on average each bottle would need to carry about 122 grams of carbohydrates in to make up those leftover carbs. Now if you actually look at the image, the bottles aren't all the same size, so we can assume some had more, some had less. But still, it gives us an idea of how the fueling strategy was set up. It is normal for a triathlete to get a bigger chunk of carbs and fluids in on the bike when you can carry more bottles and it's easier to take it all in before switching to gels and smaller amounts of fluid on the run. So in terms of logistics, this is not impossible. So we'll park this to the side for now. Next, let's run through the sodium and fluid numbers. Each 60-gram serving of the carb mix he reportedly used contains 54 grams of carbohydrates and 348 milligrams of sodium. To get 1,100 grams of carbohydrates from bottles, you'd need about 20 servings. That adds up to just over 7,100 milligrams of sodium for the whole race because the gels contain almost zero sodium. Fluid intake was reported at 939 milliliters of fluid per hour. Across 8 hours, that comes to 7.5 liters in total. Put those two numbers together and you're looking at a sodium concentration of about 950 milligrams of sodium per litre of fluid. That concentration is within the ballpark of what I would consider sensible for long hot racing and aligns with sport nutrition guidelines. If anything, it might be a little bit on the low side given the conditions, and it's not unusual for triathletes to go up to about 1,500 milligrams of sodium per litre of fluid. So in that respect, I have no major concerns about the fluid and sodium setup. But here's where it starts to get controversial when we talk about carbohydrate utilization or oxidation or burning. Because yes, you can ingest 182 grams of carbohydrates per hour, so you can physically guzzle it down into your stomach. But the question is, can your body actually use it? And this is where the physiology doesn't quite line up, at least based on the data we have. In the lab using isotope tracer studies, the maximum exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rate we see is about 90 to 105 grams per hour. Isotope tracer studies, by the way, are where researchers can track exactly what proportion of ingested carbs are being burned in real time, so they can essentially see input against output. And exogenous carbs means carbohydrates that you consume, as in they're from outside of the body, whereas endogenous means energy liberated from the stores that you already have, as in muscle glycogen. In some extreme cases in the labs, you might see figures nudging above 110 grams of carbs per hour via exogenous oxidation. As far as research goes, That's the ceiling. Beyond that, you don't seem to get a linear return. So more carbs ingested doesn't equal more carbs burned. So when we're talking about 182 grams of carbohydrates per hour being ingested, that's almost double what has ever been reliably shown to be oxidized or burned. And many of these studies are not just casual lab studies either. They're using well-trained endurance athletes already adapted to high carbohydrate intakes. Now your body can oxidize or burn more carbohydrate than that in total. About 3 to 5 grams per minute when you include stored glycogen or endogenous carbohydrate oxidation. But from intake alone, you are capped. And that is why the current consensus guidelines for endurance sports nutrition has always recommended up to about 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. But I agree that for some triathletes, this number is just too low, and they can and should target higher than this. But anything much higher than consuming 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and you're into speculative territory, where we're almost purely anecdotal, although I have no doubt that some of the big sports brands and athletes are running their own metabolic tests and looking at these exact things that I'm talking about, so exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates, in way more detail. Now, by the way, if you're sat there wondering how all of these nutrition elements slot together, I've put together a free fueling guide for triathletes that takes you through exactly that. It'll show you how to fuel your sessions properly so that you can train harder, recover quicker, and avoid the kind of mistakes that could ruin your racing. The link is in the description and comment section of this video if you want to grab it. I've distilled my 6 years of experience working with amateur and pro triathletes into a practical guide for you to get you on the right track with your nutrition. But back to Casper's nutrition plan. What does this all mean? Well, it is entirely possible that Casper Stornes was carrying those bottles and those gels, and it's possible he even smashed that many carbs across the whole of his race. But the idea that all of that was absorbed and then oxidized in real time? Very unlikely, at least in my opinion, although quite honestly, I would absolutely love to be proved wrong here. But it's more likely that a lot of that carbohydrate just sat in his gut, not really doing much. So essentially just passing through it later on and being wasted. And that's where my skepticism creeps in, as much as I love seeing these sorts of numbers that blow my mind. Because I know from speaking to other pros, who I won't name here, that sometimes the nutrition strategy reported by sponsors isn't quite the same as what was actually consumed on the day. And I'll leave that for you to interpret how you will. It might reflect the planned intake. It might be rounding up for marketing purposes. Or it might just be an eye-catching number to grab attention. Because let's face it, 182 grams of carbohydrates per hour is a brilliant headline for a sports nutrition company who's just sponsored the winner. Now, before I carry on, I am not saying that this was the case here or that they are lying. I'm happy to take it at face value that he did consume this, but I'm just looking at it critically from a performance nutritionist lens. And I know looking in the comment section that I'm not alone in being skeptical of it. But one of my concerns here is neatly highlighted by another comment that I saw on the original post. Age group athletes seeing that number and immediately think, I need to push my intake higher. And in that person's case, pushing their half marathon carb consumption higher than their Ironman consumption is pretty much madness. And if that person doesn't end up their race with horrible stomach issues, then I'll eat my hat. I've spoken with so many triathletes who have pushed their carbohydrate numbers up in racing higher and higher, only to end up with crippling stomach problems that ruin their race. And sometimes these numbers aren't even huge. It might be 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour, because you need to know that there is a trade-off here. Yes, some people can tolerate more than 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour without any obvious stomach issues, and they might even be able to oxidize it too. But tolerance doesn't always equal absorption. Just because you don't feel sick doesn't mean that your body is actually using all of it. Beyond that ceiling of about 120 grams of carbs per hour, the risk-reward balance tips very quickly. You're more likely to end up bloated, nauseous, or running to the portaloo than you are to get any extra performance benefit. So what's the practical takeaway here? Should you copy what the Ironman World Champion supposedly did? No, not even close. But what you should do is train your gut, test your fueling in workouts, Gradually build your intake towards the 90 to 120 gram range if you want to push performance in long distance racing. Do it at race pace in training, in long intervals, and see how your body responds. But don't just jump to extremes just because of seeing these high numbers on Instagram posts. Even with pros and podium age group triathletes that I work with, I rarely recommend pushing beyond 120 grams of carbs per hour because the physiology just doesn't justify it, and the risk of things going wrong outweighs the tiny chance of extra benefit, at least in my opinion. So if you take one message from this video, it's this. Be inspired by what best in the world are doing, but don't let marketing hype wreck your own race. Your ceiling is your ceiling. Build towards it, test it in training, and remember that more isn't always better. And if you found this breakdown of Casper's nutrition interesting, then check out this video here where I go through Lionel Sanders' injury update and how you need to be aware of the mistakes that he made, because they can even apply to triathletes like you.